All right, welcome back, everyone. This is video 2 on chapter 14. Make sure you're watching this after video 1. Now we're going to talk about the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the largest and the most conspicuous part of the human brain. In fact, many people just looking at the cerebrum would call that the brain, just because visually it's the largest. It is 80% of the mass of the brain, and it is responsible for the higher mental functions. It consists of a right and a left cerebral hemisphere, which is connected by the corpus callosum. The outer region of the cerebrum is composed of 2 to 4 millimeters of gray matter, with some underlying white matter. It's characterized by the raised fold called the gyri, separated by the depressed grooves called the sulci. Together, they are called the convolutions. Each hemisphere is divided by deep sulci or fissures into 5 lobes: the frontal, the parietal, the temporal, the occipital, and the insula. Okay, let's talk a little bit about that now. Here is an image of what we're talking about. So we've already talked about the brainstem, we've already talked about the cerebellum, now we're talking about the cerebrum. Here are the different lobes: the temporal, the frontal, the parietal, the occipital. And let's go through all of these, okay? The frontal lobe. So as we begin to summarize the roles of each of these cerebral lobes, it's really hard to do that in any sort of simple manner, because many functions, like let's say vision, for example, are distributed over multiple lobes where each helps with part of that function. So we'll try to do some generalizations, but know that it's hard to do this. So the frontal lobe lies immediately behind the frontal bone, and it's superior to the eyes. From the forehead, it extends caudally to a wavy vertical groove called the central sulcus. The seat of our conscious abstract thought is here. Memory and cognitive ability and emotional processes, that's all happening here. The parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is separated from the frontal lobe by the central sulcus. It forms the uppermost part of the brain, and it underlies the parietal bone. The postcentral gyrus is in the parietal lobe, and it's responsible for taste, touch, and visual processing. So here is a little bit of sort of a, let's say, a sneak peek of what we're going to talk about later, these homunculi. But here we can see here the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, as well as the central sulcus, and we can talk a little bit more later about what these are. I know they look quite weird. So let's go on to the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is found at the rear of the head, underlying the occipital bone, and it's the principal vision center of the brain. It's where you first become aware of visual stimuli. The temporal lobe is a lateral, horizontal lobe deep to the temporal bone. It is separated from the frontal and the parietal lobes by the lateral sulcus. Hearing, smell, emotion, learning, language comprehension, and long-term memories and storage of those memories is happening here. So here's all that breaking down. It's hard, again, to say that one lobe is doing all of something. The reason for that is because, obviously, a lot of these things are shared responsibilities. So here's the insula, by the way. You have to look inside to find it. It has to do with taste, pain, sensation, being conscious, emotion, and empathy, and some cardiovascular homeostasis. But it's a good breakdown of the different things that each of these lobes do. Now let's talk about the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is the executive portion of the brain, and it allows for sensation, voluntary movement, self-awareness, communication, recognition, really too many things to list here. It's made up of gray matter, which is predominantly unmyelinated axons, remember. 40% of the brain mass is cerebral cortex, but only 2 to 3 millimeters thick, which is like 2 to 3 dimes stacked on each other. Each cerebral hemisphere controls the sensory and motor functions of the contralateral side. Pretty interesting. The hemispheres, again, are connected through the corpus callosum. So let's talk about the different sensory areas in the cerebral cortex. These sensory areas are found in either the parietal, the occipital, or the temporal lobes. And let's talk about all of them a little bit. So the first are the primary somatosensory cortex. It plays a critical role in processing afferent somatosensory input and contributes to the integration of sensory and motor signals that are necessary for skilled movement. Just posterior to the primary somatosensory cortex lies the somatosensory association cortex, which integrates sensory information from the primary somatosensory cortex, like temperature, pressure, and all those other things, and constructs an understanding of the object being felt. The visual cortex of the brain is the area of the cerebral cortex that processes visual information, and it is located in the occipital lobe. You can see it back here. The auditory cortex is found in the temporal lobe. The olfactory cortex is the portion of the cerebral cortex concerned with smell, and it's part of the cerebrum as well. The gustatory cortex is a region of the cerebral cortex responsible for the perception of taste and flavor, and you find it on the frontal lobe. And then the two major cortical functions of the vestibular cortex are spatial orientation and self-motion perception. Let's break all those down. So, the visual cortex. In the visual cortex, you have sensory fibers that cross over to the opposite side, 75% and 25% at the optic chiasm. So you can see how the visual nerves, the optic nerves, cross over here. The lateral geniculate nucleus is the visual area of the thalamus. And in the occipital lobe, you have the primary sensory area and the association areas. The processing here is different areas for different functions, like monocular versus binocular, and color, form, and movement. Okay, the visual association area surrounds the primary visual cortex. And again, vision is the sensation of bars of light on our retinal cells, the rods and the cones. The primary visual cortex tells the cells that are being stimulated, tells which cells are being stimulated and how, and then the association area lets us really see what we're looking at. It's kind of interesting in that way. The auditory cortex is found in the superior margin of the temporal lobe, next to the lateral sulcus. So the sound waves come into your ear, they excite the cochlear receptors in the inner ear, and that sends info to the auditory cortex. And there's also an auditory association area, which lets us interpret what we're hearing and also to remember, like a siren is a emergency vehicle, we need to get out of the way, things like that. The olfactory cortex, it's found in the frontal lobe just above the orbits, and the receptors in the olfactory epithelium extend through the cribriform plate and are excited by the binding of these odorants, these things that smell. And they then send their info to the olfactory cortex. This is very much involved in memory and emotion. You can imagine, smells that are familiar to you have a lot to do with memories and your emotions. Kind of interesting. The gustatory and the vestibular cortices. Gustatory, again, is taste. It's involved in taste, and it's in the parietal lobe, just deep to the temporal lobe. And the vestibular cortex is involved in balance and equilibrium, and it is in the posterior insula. Okay, the cerebral cortex, some more stuff. The primary somatosensory area receives input directly from the peripheral somatic sensory receptors, and it localizes the points of the body where the sensations are originating from. The primary areas are directly wired to those peripheral sensory receptors or motor effectors. The secondary areas receive input from the primary areas. So if we go to the somatosensory association area, it gets input from the primary association area, and it integrates and analyzes that information relative to the size, texture, and the identification of the objects. It uses memories and experiences to identify the object. Like when you pick up a pen, you know what it is because you pick it up, you feel it, and you also have memories. It's kind of cool. Here is that motor and sensory homunculi or homunculus individually. And this is just a weirdly drawn map to show the distribution of input areas for cutaneous sensations. And it has spatial discrimination, which basically means that this identifies the areas of the body that are being stimulated on which area of the brain. These are drawn also to show how much cortex is dedicated to the individual body parts being shown. Pretty cool, pretty cool. Okay, lateralization. Let's talk a little bit about that, and then we'll end video 2 here. This is the fact that certain activities are almost exclusively the domain of one of the two hemispheres. In most people, the left hemisphere has more control over language, math, and logic, and the right hemisphere is geared toward musical, artistic, and other creative endeavors. And so this is the time where you hear people say, oh, you're a left brain or you're a right brain person, just based on the things that you like doing. It's kind of interesting in that way to think about why these things might be split. This is a lot of research could still be done. Most individuals that are left cerebral dominant are right-handed, and obviously the same goes for vice versa. Really cool. So that's the end of video 2. We will see you in the next one.